10:01. I will give it 1 more minute
Yeah.
if we have more attendees to join us.
Vabbè.
Welcome, Majana. Okay, let's start our talk. Good morning from San Francisco, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our Research Brown Bag series. I am Chen Wei. I'm Associate Professor of Management and today's moderator too. This series is part of the Responsible Innovation and Entrepreneurship Initiative at San Francisco State University, Lam Family College of Business. And Minu Kumar is our founder director, and Ian Sinapialas is our associate director for research. And if you have some excellent research idea and you are seeking, to collaborate with us, feel free to reach out to our team. If you are joining us for the very first time, here's a quick overview. The goal of our research, innovation, and entrepreneurship research initiative is to share high impact and rigorous scholarship in responsible innovation and entrepreneurship, as well as cutting-edge research methods. Each semester, we host two research brown bags, one focused on a research domain talk in responsible innovation and entrepreneurship, and the other one on research methods, with experts, guest speakers leading the way. Uh, this year, we have Dr. Bernd Stahl. He's going to share with us on a research domain talk. And next week, also on Monday, November 4th, we will be having Dr. Pinar Oskan, a leader research method talk on case studies. So this is our third year hosting these virtual research brown bags, and we have welcomed scholars from around the world to share their research and insights. So this session will be recorded and uploaded to our YouTube channel. I will also add the YouTube channel link on the chat later. So feel free to subscribe our channel. We will also add your email to our mailing list to keep you informed, about future talks. We are here to learn and grow together. So I hope you found the series both enriching and engaging. As today's moderator, I will be monitoring the chat for your questions and comments throughout the presentation and keeping us on schedule. Also, feel free to, raise your hands and ask questions during the presentation. Our session will run for 90 minutes. Um, so I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Bernd Carsten Stahl, today. He's a professor of critical research in technology at the School of Computer Science of the University of Nottingham, where he leads the Responsible Digital Future group. His research covers philosophical issues arising from the intersections of business, technology, and information. This includes ethical questions of current and emerging of ICTs, critical approaches to information systems, and issues related to responsible research and innovation. At present, he's particularly interested in exploring the role of the metaphor of an ecosystem when exploring ethical and social issues of emerging technologies such as AI. Smart information system, which use AI techniques like machine learning and big data, hold great promise for advancing fields such as healthcare, transportation, business, and environmental sustainabilities. However, they also raise ethical and social concerns, including biases, discriminations, and power imbalances. So, based on the Sharpa project fundings, this presentation will explore the ecosystem metaphor as a framework to understand smart information systems, ethical issues, and discuss how it can guide recommendations for policymakers and stakeholders. The presentation is also based on the material developed in a book written by Dr. Bernd Stahl, which is freely available via open access. I will also add the link on the chat later. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Bernd Stahl. Please take it away. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Chen-Wei. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the introduction. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Good. Right, so I am based at the University of Nottingham, and hello to Sarika with a PhD from Nottingham. I didn't expect to see somebody from California to have their PhD from here, but why not? So I'm, as Chen-Wei said, I'm professor at the School of Computer Science in Nottingham. I joined Nottingham a couple of years ago. Before that, I was at De Montfort University, which is in Leicester, which is a bit south of Nottingham, also in the middle of England somewhere. And I've been doing research around ethical and social aspects of IT for quite a long time. Some of this background, some of the work I've done in the past informs what I'm going to talk about. But the focus of the presentation today is on the Sherpa project. Sherpa was an EU project that ran under the current framework program, no, actually under the previous framework program, so Horizon 2020, which is the big umbrella funding structure that the European Union uses. So it ran from 2018 to 2021. And that was just about at the time when the concept of AI, the broader use of AI started to bubble up, started to become very prominent, when the AI hype was very difficult to deny, and also when initial attempts to regulate AI started to be discussed. So the Sherpa project looked at, or the way we framed it at the time was, we tried to sidestep the question of what is AI, because it was already very obvious in 2018 that AI is a very complex term with many different meanings, and we originally talked about smart information systems. The idea was to specifically look at machine learning technologies and the link between those techniques, those AI approaches, if you will, and their applications. I come back to the whole question of terminology as I go through the presentation. But if you hear me talk about smart information systems, that's because it was part of the way we describe the project. In current terminology, I think AI is probably roughly equivalent. Right, so what I'll do is I'll talk you through the Sherpa project, and then I'll tell you what I think we've learned from it and how that informs this idea of ecosystem, and why I think ecosystems is an interesting way of describing AI that can help us get a better understanding of ethical and social issues than other ways of looking at AI. I will start by going through the logic of the Sherpa project, so the justification and the structure of it, and then I'll come to the findings and outputs. So the Sherpa project was organized around 5 challenges. So these challenges correspond to the way we wrote the proposal, to work packages and so on. But on an intellectual basis, the first challenge that we faced was the question of what is it that people are concerned about when they look at those smart information systems. So if you see SIS here, that's smart information systems. So what are the ethical issues? And we had a particular focus on human rights. So what are ethical and human rights implications of those smart information systems? So this was a descriptive part of the project where we try to explore actual ways in which people feel concerned about these technologies. The way we wanted to do that, or the way we did it as well, was to do a set of case studies of current uses of these systems in real life organizations, We then wanted to look at a set of scenarios where we wanted to explore near-term future developments. We had a specific interest in questions of cybersecurity and cyber threats, and we did two sets of literature review type research, one around ethical impacts and social tensions of these technologies, and the second one around the human rights frameworks. So that was number one. It's the descriptive question of what is it that people are concerned about? What are the challenges? The case studies we did were, most of those were based on a single organization. So we did a set of interviews and in some cases, additional studies by interacting with members of those organizations. And the idea was to get a broad overview of what are the various applications and what are people concerned about in those applications. So we had a company that looked at the Internet of Things. We talked to government, in particular municipal government. We talked to cities that were using AI. We had a case study looking at the use of AI in agriculture. We had a smart cities one and a scientific one. So all of these were individual case studies where we tried to explore what the issues were. The other 5 were in the area of insurance, energies, utilities, communication, media, manufacturing, and retail. So the idea is that from looking at those case studies, we would be able to extract what the possible issues and questions are. All of these, by the way, if you're interested, are individually written up as case studies, which you can download from the Sherpa website. And most of them have also been published in some way or the other, partly as individual case studies, and we also have at least one combined case study paper that looks at organizational challenges arising from AI. So those were the case studies. Those were real-life present users of technology, and then we also wanted to explore likely and short-term future developments. So we looked at things that were at the time already present, that were, so we're looking back at 2018 now, or 2018, 2019, that existed already, but where there were strong expectations that they would quickly develop and have significant impact. And you see the examples that we looked at here. Predictive computing, predictive policing, the use of AI in warfare, deepfakes, mimicking technologies, the use of AI in education, and autonomous vehicles. So for each of those, we ran a workshop. We brought together a set of experts and tried to explore what developments were likely to arise in the short-term future. So that was number one. That was our attempt to capture the scene. What are the issues? Number 2 then is, well, we realized even though we were a reasonably large consortium, so we had, I think, 11 partners, 3.5 years duration, 2-point-something million euros budget. So it was a significant project, but of course, even a project of that size can only cover a very small fraction of what's out there. So we wanted to make sure that we have a broader understanding of what the social perceptions are. So what are the stakeholders' views of ethical issues, social issues, human rights issues of AI? And in order to achieve that, we constituted a stakeholder board with about 25 members drawn from different stakeholder groups. We did a set of interviews with experts, we did an online survey, and we also did a Delphi study throughout the project. So that in addition to the social perceptions, to help us understand what the issues are, we also wanted to understand what possible ways are to mitigate those issues. So what are the options or that could be used to address ethical human rights questions in smart information systems? We suggested the following 5 bullet points because at the time they seemed to be the most likely and most relevant one. So we wanted to look at guidelines for researchers and for people who do innovation in this space. We wanted to explore regulatory options. We looked at questions of standardization. What role can standards and should standards play? We wanted to look at technical options, in particular with regards to the cybersecurity side of things. And we wanted to write the terms of reference for a regulator, which is a special case of the second bullet point of the regulatory options. So these are the ways in which we thought these ethical issues could be addressed, and we wanted to come to a better understanding of how that might work, to then come up with a set of recommendations at the end. We then wanted to see whether those possible solutions, those mitigation options, were actually likely to be successful, whether they might lead to outcomes that were desirable. So we had the challenge 4 of testing and validating those possible solutions. And the way we did that in practice was through a set of focus groups. So we brought together all of this, or the majority of the work here happened under COVID conditions. So a lot of the activities were done online. So we had a set of focus groups with a range of stakeholders to explore whether they thought that our suggestions would make sense and might help to mitigate those problems. And then finally, we had the question, well, even if we come up with good suggestions, then what? What happens afterward? EU projects, if you've ever been involved in them, tend to have a strong emphasis on impact, on practical consequences. So we had, like pretty much any other EU project, we had dissemination, communication, and a website and so on. But I think there are 2 aspects that make the Sherpa project stand out, which you don't find as standard activities in EU projects. One is the artistic representation. So we had an artist in residence who was a member of the consortium. He was a fully paid up consortium partner. And if you have the time and if you are so inclined, I would invite you to have a look at the Sherpa project website and look at the artistic representations that you can find there. So the artist actually created a separate website, which he called Sherpa Pieces. And he did a few really interesting things. So as one example, he built a water gun that was AI controlled and that would only squirt particular parts of the population. So you could put a facial recognition system on it and it would, for example, only squirt male or female, depending on how it identified them. The interesting thing about that was that it was modeled on autonomous weapons that already exist. So at the time, this sort of technology allegedly already was used in the DMZ in Korea. So it's not completely out of the blue, but by turning this into a water gun and turning it into a playful idea, he got further audiences involved. So that's one example. He's done a bunch of other really interesting things. So I would, as I said, I would encourage you to look at that. The other thing where we stand out, and that's the red bit at the bottom, is that we had an explicit advocacy arm. So we realized that as an EU project, we were very closely linked to one of the key policy organizations that is likely to drive policy, legislation, regulation around AI. So we, from the outset, tried to engage with policymakers during the work of the project. And as part of that, we did a bunch of things. So we had a number of conversations with members of the European Parliament, with members of or representatives of the nation states. We talked to people from the European Commission. We actually had our final event co-hosted by the European Parliament. And that was very fortunate in that the project coincided with the drafting, well, first of all, with the high-level expert group on AI that the EU put together. And secondly, then also with the drafting of what now will become the EU AI Act. So they first started with a white paper and then turned this into the act. So we were very closely involved in the conversations there. Whether we had an impact and what that impact is of course very difficult to say, but we were certainly part of the conversation when it happened. Right, so that's the logic of the project. That's the background. That's what I'm going to build on. I'm now going to say a few more things about AI, because as the project progressed, the term AI became more and more prominent. And at some point, we decided we can't ignore it anymore. We have to actually use it. So the question then is, what definition of AI do we want to use? And I could give you many of those definitions. So the first one here is one that the European Commission proposed initially when they first drafted their white paper, which then turned into the EU AI Act, where they say AI is a collection of technologies that combine data, algorithms, and computing power. That's pretty much anything. And so that's anything to do with computing. So that's probably a bit wide. Then below that, you see a more traditional academic definition. So AI is a combination of intelligent behavior. So technologies that do things that we typically associate with intelligence, such as perception, memory, emotion, judgment, and so on. And I'm sure you could all add 50 more of those. The problem with them is that they are either too broad or they're not particularly helpful in terms of thinking about the ethical components here. So before we then went on with the question of what do we mean by AI, we wanted to look at what is AI used for? And that's an important question with regards to ethical questions. So what are the purposes of AI? So if somebody speaks of AI, if they develop AI, what are the reasons why they want to do this? The probably most prominent one, the one that you see in a lot of policy documentations, but also in academic research, is AI as a way of increasing efficiency, of optimizing, and in the end, that leads to better organizations that do stuff better. And where done in the private sector, this leads to profit maximization. So I think that's the dominant one. That's why, why do governments throw billions and billions and billions at AI? Well, it's going to make us all rich, right? Or at least it'll make us more efficient. It's not the only one, though. And so there are other purposes that you can use AI for. So one of them is social control. The Chinese social credit scoring system is probably the most prominent example of that. But if you read Zuboff, then I think you will see that social control also plays an important role in Western big tech companies. I mean, you're in San Francisco, you know this a lot better than I do, how Google uses their, and Microsoft and all the others, how they use their market power to control us, to make us do things that they want us to do. So those are two different purposes. And we suggested, and there are of course many, many, many others, right? But we suggested that one of the purposes of AI could be to promote human flourishing. So you can use technology, any sort of technology, including AI, to help people live the lives that they want to live, to make their circumstances better. Now, I've drawn this as a Venn diagram because I'm not suggesting that these are necessarily contradictory. So, for example, the creation of efficiency and creation of wealth may well be something that you need for human flourishing. Similarly, social control may be something, as the pandemic has shown us, that is required for human flourishing. So I'm not saying that they are contradictory, but you can have different emphasis. So am I primarily interested in this, that, or the other? And we use the concept of human flourishing to represent the way we think about ethics. The argument being that this is something that is compatible with most ethical theories and certainly also very compatible with democratic views of allowing people to live their best lives, which I think is also very closely related to human rights. So that's where we put our stake in the ground in terms of ethics. And now coming back to what we mean by AI. What is AI? This is a different take on what AI is. This comes from the publication that you see on the left of the screen, which was a pro bono publication coming out of Elsevier. Now, as academics, I'm sure you all know Elsevier. It's one of the biggest publishers in the world. And one of the things that Elsevier owns is the Scopus database, which again, I assume most of you will be familiar with. So what Elsevier did, and they published this in 2018, I think, is they looked at the Scopus database and they tried to identify what are the topics that are covered in the AI discourse. They came up with, I think, somewhere around 800 different keywords, and those are the probably unreadable bits around the external circle. And then they tried to cluster those keywords, actually using AI techniques to find out what are the key components of that discourse. And the big strands in the middle are some of the terms that you would expect to be linked to AI, things like machine learning, but also things like fuzzy logic, computer vision. So traditional AI topics. The interesting part of that is that while there is a lot of overlap, there's very little actually in the center. So there's very little that everybody who talks about AI agrees on. They also looked at different types of discourses. They not just looked at the academic discourse, they also looked at policy discourses, they looked at educational discourses. And it turns out that the meaning of AI across different discourses varies significantly. So that left us with the problem of, well, what do we mean by AI? So if we want to do a project that looks at ethical and human rights issues of AI, how do we deal with the problem that there is no generally accepted definition? So what we then said that instead of trying for us to add another definition of AI, we wanted to look at, well, what do people actually use it for? So when they use the term AI, what do they refer to? And we suggested there are three groups of technologies or applications that people refer to when they talk about AI. One is narrow AI, machine learning in particular, as still the key component of the technical progress that has led to the current hype of around AI. But it's not just about the technology, it's not just about machine learning. The other bubble at the bottom now is what we call converging socio-technical systems. So that's when people talk about AI, not so much with a view to a technique, a piece of kit, but at the way in which this plays out in broader socio-technical environments. So where the top one might be something like a particular flavor of machine learning. The bottom one might be something like the use of that technique for the identification of fraud in banking, something like that. So it's a different scale. And the bottom one is more interested in the social context. And then finally, there is a lot of reference to artificial general intelligence, to the idea of these technologies that are truly human-like in terms of their capabilities. Now, arguably, these don't exist, and there's a lot of discussion whether they ever will and can exist. But certainly in the discourse, they play a very strong role, and they drive what people are concerned about and how they interpret AI. So we said these are the three concepts of use of AI, and they all have characteristics or certain features that influence how we think about them also in terms of ethics. So machine learning is opaque. We don't necessarily know what happens with it under the box. It's therefore potentially unpredictable, and it requires, well, a lot of machine learning techniques require big data. So large amounts of data, which certainly if personal data can raise all sorts of questions around data protection. Then we have those converging socio-technical systems, and these are characterized by the fact that they have an impact on us. So they change the way we live our lives in many different ways. For example, by manipulating us, by making us or steering us in certain directions which we may or may not want to follow. And they are perceived to be rather autonomous. So they do stuff without immediate input from the user. And then finally, we have the AGI side, which is characterized by big questions, for example, about what it means to be intelligent, what's the nature of intelligence, what does it mean to be human, what's the nature of reality. So big ticket items. If we take those three different ways of thinking about AI, or the three different uses of AI, then you can come up with a classification of issues. By the way, I'm not suggesting that this is the only way to categorize the use of AI. You could do this differently, but to us that made sense, and we built on that. So what are the issues that people are concerned about? So if you have machine learning as your focus, then there are specific topics that may arise from the nature of machine learning and the types of machine learning techniques we currently use. The socio-technical systems raise questions around how we live our lives in a world that is increasingly digitized, connected, and driven by AI. And then AGI raises questions which I would call metaphysical questions, and maybe even theological questions, as I'll argue in a second. So what are those issues? So specific issues related to machine learning would be things like bias, discrimination, the fact that because we don't understand what exactly happens under the box or under the hood of the box, we may lead to, or may have as an outcome, biases which may come from the training data, which may come from the way the algorithm was constructed, and that may lead to discrimination, which we find problematic, possibly even illegal. Large data, in particular personal data, raises question of security, raises question of data protection, and many others. So those are very specific issues related to machine learning, but the question of living in a digital world raises other questions. It raises the question of autonomy, the question of the autonomy of the systems, but also the question of the autonomy of us as human beings. It leads to issues around power and economic distribution. So who gains from the whole thing, who has to pay for it? The way we interact, for example, in warfare, autonomous weapons have the potential to very much change the way, not just we fight wars, but also how we start them, who starts them, why they get started. So it can change the nature of warfare. And overall, there are questions around distribution of benefits, distribution of risk, distribution of cost. Then we have those metaphysical questions, which are things like, will those things ever exist? Will they be super intelligent? How would we know they're super intelligent? What does that mean in the first place? Which links to the singularity, these very abstract thoughts. For me, a more interesting question is, does that change the way we see ourselves, what we perceive to be human? Does the perception of human nature change because of the capabilities of technologies? So you see there's a broad range of issues, and some of those may be capable of being resolved through technical, legal, and other remedies. Right? So the whole big research area of explainable AI to me has to do with this top right-hand corner. Can we understand what happens within the system, and can that help us identify biases and then possibly remove them, or at least be capable of mitigating them? Not everything is, I think, capable of this specific type of remedy. Some of those questions, the questions on the bottom, the question of how we live our lives in the digital world, really are not technical, but they are political questions. They have to do with how we distribute wealth in society. They are questions around how our commonwealth is constituted. So they're policy questions and they are political questions in many cases. And then we have on the left-hand side here our metaphysical questions, which really remain that. I think many of them are philosophical and possibly theological questions, which may not be subject to resolution at all, but which may be questions that we will continue to ponder, no matter where technology goes. The point here being, again, like just as we have a range of very different ethical issues, we have a range of very different ways of looking at them and trying to find resolutions to them. And in some cases, that may not be possible. So that was sort of the problem space. What can we do about it? And I'm suggesting here a set of different types of mitigation measures. So I'm suggesting these four. Again, you could do this differently. I'm not saying that this is the only classification that makes sense, but it's one that made sense to us. So we have policy and regulatory options, we have organizational options, we have technical, and we have individual ones. And just to give you a flavor of what we mean by those, so policy and regulatory are, on the one hand, specific regulation around AI, which at the time when we wrote this didn't exist, which is now coming online in the EU, for example, in the form of the EU AI Act. In the UK, there are various regulatory suggestions. I know that in America, things are happening as well. But it's not just specific regulation, it can also be other things. So the application of existing law to AI in different ways. So for example, human rights law is something that's been suggested as an important contributor to how we deal with AI. Many other legal or aspects of the law are relevant as well. Competition law, liability law. And then there are questions of putting this into place. So do we need a new regulator? What would that regulator look like? So those are policy and regulatory options. Organizations, and those are both the organizations that build these systems and the organizations that use them, can do many, many different things in order to identify and address possible ethical issues. and those include things like risk management. They could do impact assessments. They can include those questions in quality assurance, data governance. They can make it part of corporate social responsibility, and many options more. On the technical level, I've already mentioned security and data protection, technical aspects of that. Standardization may help identify the way in which technical issues or technical approaches can be deployed. There can be design guidelines. There can be other ways of technically implementing certain measures to ensure that ethical issues are addressed. And then finally, as an individual, you can look at ethical frameworks, you can look at professional bodies to give you guidance, you can adopt particular methodologies for the design of technologies, and so on. The point here is, very similar to the previous one, this is a complex landscape. So we have lots of different types of mitigation options, and in each category, we have further options that you may or may not want to pursue. So it's a very complex picture. And I think this is my last attempt to hammer home the problem of complexity is the stakeholders. So who are the ones who are actually supposed to do this? I'm suggesting 3 groups: policy type stakeholders, individuals, and organizations. Again, you could do this differently if you wanted. Policy ones are the ones who set research policy, innovation policy, and general policy. We, as an EU project, of course, had a strong interest in what the EU does, but there are, of course, national policymakers that play a role. There are research funders that set policy that has impact on how AI is developed. And there are others, such as specific regulators, but also ethics bodies, if you have to go through ethics approval. There are international bodies that try to get in on the action. You're probably all aware of UNESCO, OECD, being very active in the space of ethics of AI. So these are various types of policy stakeholders. Then you have a whole set of organizations that are of relevance here. So you have companies that develop technologies, you have companies that deploy and use it. You have other types of organizations that play a role, such as professional bodies, such as media, but also us as people in universities, educators, standardization bodies, many types of organizations that form part of this AI system. And then finally, we have individuals who, on the one hand, make up all those collective bodies, and on the other hand, have their own agency in different ways. So they may be users, they may be experts, they may be developers, they may be activists, they may be in civil society organizations pushing for particular agendas, and there may also be non-users who are affected and who have a role to play here. So we now have the complexity of the ethical issues, we have the complexity of the mitigation options, and we have the complexity of the stakeholders. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with the insight that there is no magic bullet. There's no simple solution. There's no one way to fix it, to deal with ethics of AI. So we have epistemic complexity. Just understanding and doing research on these issues is complicated enough. We have a lot of existing responsibilities which are distributed in complex ways. So it's not as if this whole landscape is just emerging from nothing, but it comes in places where we have regulators, where we have companies, where we have liabilities already in place, and new technologies affect those in subtle and often unforeseen ways. And to make things worse, we have technical progress. Things develop very quickly. When we drew all this up, things like large language models weren't really prominent yet. We had no idea that ChatGPT would hit the world in a very quick and unforeseeable manner. So there is this complexity. What we probably need is an intelligent mix of options, of mitigations, of ways of dealing with them. The question is, how can we address that? How can we think about it? What we're suggesting from the Sherpa project is that the use of this idea of an ecosystem may help us better understand and better think about these questions. Now, we didn't come up with the idea of an AI ecosystem. That's been around for a long time. And it's been very prominent in particular the policy discourse. So the EU white paper, for example, already talked about it. The high-level expert group used the term. What we've done is we try to think about what does this ecosystem metaphor mean for the way we think about ethics, and what does it mean for the way we think about governance of AI. So the question we wanted to ask is, how can we conceptualize an ecosystem of artificial intelligence that fosters and promotes human flourishing? What would that look like? And how would we know whether we're going in the right direction with it? In order to answer the question, we first needed to look into a little bit of systems theory and ecosystem theory to identify and understand what an ecosystem is and what are the characteristics of an ecosystem, to then think about how an ecosystem can be steered in a desired direction. So what are characteristics of an ecosystem? It starts with, like most systems, the boundaries are not always clear. So what exactly is part of the ecosystem, not part of the ecosystem, often is contested and can change over time, and arguably is part of what the observer sees in the ecosystem and not necessarily part of a natural state of affairs. Ecosystems are typically open, so you can have new members join the ecosystem, you can have members leave the ecosystem, die out. So they're not static, they interact with their environment. We specifically looked at not so much as the biological ecosystem literature, but we looked at the innovation ecosystem literature. And one of the reasons why the innovation studies community has adopted the term, arguably, I believe, is that they like the idea of ecosystem as a way of explaining change. And the way change happens in natural ecosystem is through evolution. So some members die out, some change, and as a whole, or as a consequence, the overall ecosystem changes. So we have evolution, which may mean co-evolution of the different bits of the ecosystem, and different members can learn from each other. They don't necessarily have to coexist peacefully. They can also kill each other, but they're definitely interdependent in many, many different and complicated ways. So the relationship between the actors within the ecosystem are complex and often difficult to predict. So these are some of the characteristics of an ecosystem, and we asked, well, what does that tell us about how we can intervene in an ecosystem? What do we need to think about? The first one is that if you want to successfully intervene in an ecosystem, you need to delimit it properly. So you need to say, what exactly is the ecosystem? What's in, what's out, where does it end? And that can be a geographical border. It can also be a conceptual border. It can be a technical border. So you can have different interlinking ecosystems. So you can have different overlapping AI ecosystems, for example, regional, international ones, or look at ecosystems from different technology perspectives. So there's a delimitation. You need to say what exactly it is you're interested in. Secondly, for such a socio-technical ecosystem to survive, thrive, and prosper, it has to have a knowledge base. So the members of the ecosystem as a whole needs to understand certain things. So there needs to be technical expertise, but it also needs to understand key concepts. It needs to understand procedures. For example, there needs to be an awareness of what a stakeholder is and how you can engage them. And it needs to be able to update and build the capacity to create its knowledge and keep it up to date. And then finally, there's questions around ecosystems and governance. So what does a governance system of an ecosystem need to look like in order to be successful? So we call this adaptive governance. Well, we didn't come up with the term, but the idea is that the governance structures need to be flexible. They need to be able to learn. They need to be able to adapt to the changes of the system itself. And finally, the meta-responsibility term at the bottom points to this idea that you have existing responsibilities within the ecosystem, and meta-responsibility is the idea that there needs to be a way of aligning existing responsibilities in ways that are conducive to flourishing. So these are some of the things that we think, or we believe that one needs to take into consideration when promoting certain ways of dealing with AI ecosystems. That led to our recommendations, and I'm now coming to the final bit of the presentation. So how can we do this? What needs to happen in order to move from AI ecosystems to systems that promote human flourishing? So we suggested recommendations following from the three main features that I had on the last slide. So about the limitations, about the governance, about the knowledge base within the system. So for the delimitation, we only have one recommendation, which is there needs to be conceptual clarity in terms of what is the system. So if you want to intervene in an ecosystem, then you need to say what exactly the boundaries are. In terms of governance, we suggested that what an AI ecosystem needs is a regulatory framework, which may take many different forms. So this was before the EU AI Act, or we came up with this while the EU AI Act was developed. So it was very uncertain at the time what this regulatory framework would look like. We suggested that in addition to the regulatory framework, you probably need a gatekeeper, some type of organization that feels responsible for overseeing and providing the expertise for the regulatory framework, and we call that the EU Agency for AI. Of course, this being an EU project, we had this focus on the EU. A similar argument could be made on a national level or possibly even on an international level. And then finally, we suggested that as a governance structure, it would be really helpful if on the organizational level, there were a role within organizations that would take responsibility for these questions. And we call this the AI ethics officer. And that was developed in parallel or with the inspiration of the data protection officer that exists in European companies because of the data protection regulation. So you have somebody who is responsible to ensure that the organization complies with the principles in a particular area. And then finally, in terms of knowledge, we suggested that there needs to be, or it would be helpful to have knowledge in certain areas. So we suggested that it would be useful to have a baseline principle of AI impact assessment. We suggested that there should be an agreed standard for ethics by design for AI. We all agreed that training and education plays a key role here, that standardization can contribute to that, and that information security needs to be part of all of this. So each of the little rectangles there, if you look at the website, there's a lot more detail on how we think they could be filled with life. Just to give you, to wrap it up, the point here is that these are not standalone recommendations, but that you know, in the spirit of systems theory, you need to look at the system as a whole. So these different recommendations are related. So the delimitation, for example, may provide the basis for the knowledge base, but similarly, the knowledge base informs what exactly the boundaries are. A governance structure may incentivize the creation of new knowledge, whereas the new knowledge may create the governance structure. The governance may consider the delimitation, well, has to consider the delimitation in order to be relevant. So you have the big bubbles that are related, but the same is true for the little bubbles. So for example, a regulatory framework may require an AI ethics officer in a company. It may create an agency. If you have an ethics by design structure that can include and build on AI impact assessment, it may require training, it can draw on standards and security principles. And then you have links between and across those bubbles. So an AI ethics officer, for example, might require a certain trainings program. A regulatory framework could mandate the use of AI impact assessment. So the idea is that these are not independent, but they actually are strongly linked, and you need to look at the whole picture at the same time. So this is the expression of that very same thought that I've just gone through in a way that you find on the website. So you see our main bubbles, you see the individual recommendations, and you see some details on what those individual recommendations look like. So I'm coming to an end. We've already heard that I've published a couple of books around this. So the book on the left is really the basis of this talk. This is where I developed these ideas in more detail. And then we've tried to think about applications and cases of that. So the book on the right is an attempt to exemplify some of the key suggestions and recommendations we come up with using examples. Both of those are free to download from the Springer website. So if you're interested, feel free to have a look at them. And with that, I stop. Any questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Stahl, for this insightful talk. Please feel free to, unmute and ask your questions. JP, you are muted. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Hi. Yeah, thanks for this great talk, Chen Wei, for organizing it. Thanks, Professor Stahl, for being here. I wanted to ask you, oh, sorry, I'm JP. I'm at University of San Francisco down the road here. And I just wanted to ask about the current discourse, because I see that your book was published in 2021. And of course, there's been this explosion since then. And I wanted to ask you about this sort of techno maximizing discourse that we have a lot here in California and Silicon Valley. It's almost as if there's a larger meta question of whether ethics should even apply in this case. There's this argument floating around that these restrictions are unethical. You should let technology follow its own course when you have something this great and this wonderful to pursue, tied with this argument of sort of looking at the whole EU regime as this very negative thing that's hindered AI progress before it's had a chance to take off. So I was wondering, from the standpoint of your ethical work, if you have a response to these kind of techno maximizers that we run into all the time around here.
Yeah, I mean, you know those techno maximizers much better than I do. I mean, they're not as prominent around here. So I don't think I've ever met one. But I think the argument would be that even this techno-maximizing ideology, as you've described it, really is an ethical one, right? It's based on ethical assumptions. It's based on this idea that you can create wealth, maximize everybody's benefits, and that by regulating it, you reduce the benefit that can be achieved, and that's a bad thing in terms of ethics. Right? So it's not just we're not making a lot of money, but it's actually we're making the world a worse place. And I think that's where, to me, that's where the argument could come in, where you could say, well, if that's what you argue, then let's pick apart what you mean by it's a good thing or it's a bad thing. And then it's very easy to come from the wealth creation to wealth distribution, and seeing very obviously that wealth creation alone isn't really going to do it, no matter what ethical perspective you take. Now, whether you are an explicit utilitarian, which I suspect must be somewhere in the background of this tech maximizing, but even then, creating numerous trillion-dollar companies when you have great poverty, deprivation, and hunger in the streets would very obviously seem to be not acceptable, right? I don't know whether that would convince anybody. I also don't think you can force people to be good by arguing. But I think that this completely unfettered growth of technology is not something that you can really seriously promote as the ethically optimal option, no matter where you come from.
No, thank you. That makes total sense. But I just think there is this discourse here of regulation and ethical concerns holding you back in this sort of competitive race between these major nation states that I think is very difficult for us to deal with.
I think I don't think it's an entirely unreasonable argument. So I'm not saying that they're wrong. I think regulation needs to be considered. But living in democratic societies, we typically agree that we need a certain base level of regulation, at least, right? So we all think freedom is great, but we all still think that killing people should be forbidden, right? And I think the same base level must be true in terms of technology as well. So there are certain things where we say we don't want to restrict people's freedom more than necessary, but there will probably be limits to what we allow people to do in the interest of the greater good. And that's how societies work. Huh?
Thank you.
Denise.
Sorry, I couldn't find the hand
thing to raise my hand, but thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciated it. I tend to lean towards deontological approaches to these tricky issues as it comes to AI or a lot of different aspects. What are your thoughts on a duty-based perspective?
Well, I mean, I'm currently teaching professional ethics for final year undergrads, and I do think that deontological approaches have or represent an intuition that many of us share, that to do the right thing means you have to do the thing for the right reason, including your duties, your intention, the maxim that you want to follow to, use a Kantian idea. I do also think that that's not all. I think the reason why we have so many different ethical theories is that we have intuitions about what's right and wrong, which cannot be expressed in terms of a single consistent theoretical position. So I would consider myself an ethical pluralist, and I would say, well, different ethical positions have their merits, and in some cases they make sense, in some cases they make less sense. I'm also, as you may have heard at this point, I'm German, right? As a German, and I've studied philosophy in Germany, so I'm sort of genetically a Kantian. But I do think that there is a limit to how far you can take the reliance on a particular ethical position. So, short answer, deontology, I'm all for it, but it's not the only thing that's out there.
Thank you so much. I also see questions on the chat. Charis, are you here? Do you want to ask the question? Charis' question is like, where would you situate the discussion on energy requirements and such?
I think that's probably part. So if you go to my 3 bubbles of main ethical concerns, it's somewhere in this living in a digital world. To me, this is a distribution question. So we have additional energy requirements because of the technology, and these need to be met but traditionally by society. I mean, I hear that Google is now buying and building nuclear power plants, which I find mind-boggling that you can have a company owning nuclear power plants, but apparently that's possible. But it is something where we can, it's an example of the need of the community to contribute to something, and that therefore for the need of the community to agree that it's worth doing so. Because the energy could be used for something else, or we could save energy if it weren't used by AI. So I think this is not a technical problem, it's a political problem. It's the question of how we deal with the distribution of benefits and costs. And I think in this case, you'll probably in the end have some people sitting on old uranium depleted rods for the next 50,000 years who did not benefit from the advantages of AI at all. And I think that's something that we want to think about now, rather than when it's all too late.
Yes, Stefan?
Hey. Hi, I'm coming from New Jersey, from, I guess, the other coast for some of you and the other country for others. There was you had mentioned some issues in the top box there, machine learning and such. And one thing that was not there that has become quite a topic of conversation are errors and hallucinations. So I'll ask you to comment on that particular issue, but also about who's responsible for those and for the consequences of those.
Yeah. So when I drew this box originally, AI didn't hallucinate, or at least it wasn't a widely discussed topic. There is an interesting question whether that's sort of a technical issue or whether that's a broader issue. I guess on the one hand, you could say the reliability of the outputs of the technology is a technical thing, so it's something that should be open to testing and verification. But on the other hand, of course, it then relates to deep question about truth. Right? So when AI makes up things that are probably obviously wrong, then that's easily identifiable. But when it says things where we may disagree on what's true or not, that may be a different issue. So no, it didn't exist at the time. I do think it certainly warrants being included, maybe in the top right hand. The question is, who's responsible for that? I think that's the more interesting one. And what I think is currently missing in the overall AI landscape, even though I believe the EU is actually trying to address that, probably very much to the disappointment of the tech bros, is this question of liability. So at the moment, and I think the reason why that's so is that the software industry, from Microsoft still being a garage company, has been very successful in avoiding liability. And unlike most other industries, right? So if your car screws up, then it's relatively easy most of the time to find out who's liable. If your computer crashes, it's not. I think what's required are liability rules that work in practice. So whether that ends up being the liability of the producer of the system, whether we all start to sue OpenAI, or whether that sits somewhere in the intermediates, I don't have a strong position on. But what I do think is that we need liability rules where people can get redress if something goes wrong. And I do believe that that's something that the EU is trying to push with its current regulatory regime. I believe that's going to be very complicated. I'm not suggesting at all that that's going to be a simple thing to do, but I think that's where we need to go.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? Feel free to put your question on the chat, or just unmute yourself and ask. Dr. Stahl, I have a question. When I was looking at your slides, there was one there, you mentioned like, AI and human flourishing, and I just find it like fascinating. Like this, because we talked about AI ethics, but right now, with the power of all those, Gen AI tools and everything, I'm kind of I think I'm more like on the positive side. I feel like, AI can really enhance human, like well-being, such as like, act as like a knowledge counselor, right? Like in healthcare fields. And I wonder, like what you think about this, like what kind of potentials does AI hold for entering the healthcare industry, particularly in mental health support, because it has like a boundaryless type of patience and knowledge and it's available to you like 24/7 if we, make it possible.
Yeah. Well, so I think the reason why we chose this term flourishing is that on the one hand, it is a well-established ethical concept. It goes back to virtue ethics, Aristotle, and so on. I believe it's also compatible with other ethical theories. I do think that following the categorical imperative may lead to flourishing. But then the question is, how do you actually know whether it has led to flourishing, and what does that mean? And I think there is general agreement, and I wouldn't contradict that AI has the potential to contribute to human flourishing. So it can make our lives better in many, many, many different ways. And that's why we allow it. And that's unlike other technologies which we outlaw because we think they're mostly bad. AI is very much supported by governments around the world. It's not just seen as a competitive advantage, that too, but it is seen as something that will make the world a better place in many different ways. That's why I think the whole debate is interesting. If that weren't there, then we wouldn't need to worry about the ethics. We would just say, no, don't do it. The question is how that's going to play out in practice. And I think in the healthcare system, we see a lot of work happening at the moment where you use various bits of AI to do research, to better understand diseases, to do diagnosis, to you name it. And I think that that potential is pretty much proven, right? It can do many things. It can improve and help, for example, clinicians in better diagnosis. The example that you chose, though, the example of using AI as a mental health support tool, because it's available, I'm slightly more skeptical about that. Because if the idea is that you replace your psychologist or psychiatrist with ChatGPT, yes, you can have a nice chat with it, but does it actually take you seriously? Does it understand you? If it starts to hallucinate while you're just having your suicidal ideation, that's probably not a good thing. So that is one example where I'm at this point not particularly convinced that that's the way we want to go down. But I'm not at all denying that there are many, many, many advantages to AI.
Thank you. Yeah, Minu.
Thank you, Bernd, for a fantastic talk. You know, for me, my name is Minu, and I'm a San Francisco State University faculty also. So, you know, wonderful presentation, kind of laying out sort of the big pieces, right? The different parts of what is the AI, and you know, what are some concerns, how it's being used, and the overall kind of like landscape of it. So, thank you for that presentation to not only I guess, parse out the different pieces, but also allow us to see the connections between the different pieces. So with that said, I had a couple questions. One was relating to, you know, we work often here, and we, based on some of the regulatory actions that are coming towards these big tech companies in the space of AI. A lot of them are organizing different kinds of departments that will handle these concerns. So, you know, some of them are creating responsible innovation groups or departments. Some are creating like ethical AI kind of like groups. You know, and they from a meso standpoint, from a meso level standpoint, they're grappling with this question of how do we measure this, and how does it have an impact on their final bottom line? And this is this creates lots of kind of like dynamics within these organizations of how they situate these departments. Some of them, you know, had them, you know, situate as a separate entity in the organization that reports to the CEO and such. And then some of them, you know, have it as part of their product, you know, dispersed in the organization, almost like a cultural artifact. And then some of them, you know, have it, you know, as part of their compliance groups, you know. So I don't know if you've noticed, given the fact that Europe is slightly ahead of it with, you know, AI regulation compared to what we have here. Have you seen any best practices in companies that how to organize these responsible, you know, innovation efforts? Should it be centralized, decentralized, more kind of like both? You know, what is your take on this?
I can confirm that the same observation, that there are different models that companies play around with, that they have different types of departments that have different roles. The recommendations we produced here was this idea of the AI ethics officer, and that was based on the data protection officer. And I think the interesting part of the data protection officer coming out of the GDPR is that that is a role in an organization that forms part of the organization, but is slightly outside of it. So as a data protection officer, you actually have a certain whistleblowing protection, and you are not necessarily bound by the same type of line management and hierarchical constraints that everybody else is. And it strikes me that something like that would make sense for AI as well. So if you want to take these considerations seriously, you want to make sure that your AI ethics department is not one that the CEO can just get rid of when they produce an opinion that the CEO doesn't like. Now that within the traditional logic of a company, it doesn't work. That is something that would require legal protection, right? So to me, that is the way I think this should go. What exactly it's going to look like in the end is of course a bit difficult to say. because we can't require every company to have its own AI ethics department. We can certainly expect that from the big companies. I do think that sort of links back with the liability argument I made earlier. So I think this might be a mitigation for liability if something goes wrong. That might be a persuading argument for the companies to do it. So I guess the key part of the answer is they need a bit of independence. They can't just be, so if you have a group in an organization or an individual in an organization that's responsible for this, they need to be slightly outside the line management structure.
Okay, so a slightly different question, and then thanks JP for sharing that new piece of news, which is super tragic. But of mental health and using AI as a mental health help. There was a tragedy here in the United States recently where a young person was chatting with, I believe JP, it's character AI, right? I think it's character AI that they were chatting with, and then that person became like a girlfriend of theirs, and then they did suicidal ideation, like you just mentioned, and then the person took their life. So eventually, after, so my question is related to that. As you're seeing more and more regulation and more policy structures by the government at the macro level, especially in Europe, and we have in the US, we're making some sort of moves towards that with the presidential, commission on this issue some months back, almost a year back at this point. But are you seeing any sort of some other ways to kind of keep, hold companies responsible is legal actions, right? So, and especially if this sort of goes into the realm of liability, then, then ideas, issues of, class action lawsuits and class action lawsuits could also appear, which would then be another mechanism of responsibility. Did you account? I mean, I know somewhere you said legal in your framework, but are these sort of government actions or citizen actions? And here, yeah.
I mean, in the European legal context, this sort of class action lawsuit isn't as prominent and widely used as it would be in the US, is my understanding at least. Therefore, when we talked about regulation, we thought more about traditional legislation. But in different legal contexts, this might well play out differently. And I think that something like liability rules that would allow for class action lawsuits might be a really good mechanism to do that. Just like I think the way that in America you've dealt with the tobacco industry and similar large-scale damaging industries, you've been very successful with that. And I think having just the threat of a similar scenario dangling over the AI industry might make a huge difference. So I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't give you the ins and outs of it, but it strikes me that as a principle, it looks very promising.
Thank you, Bernd. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Any other questions? I was just at some comments on the chat, from like my perspective, I kind of feel like sometimes parents being tired of driving kids around, and I hope we can really have some regulations around like driverless cars, such as Waymo, because I have seen Waymo, like more and more Waymos driving around in San Francisco City. To allow like school kids, to use them safely to commute to school. That would be great. But I'm not, sure, this gotta be possible. And I also kind of think, there might be a lot of, like risks involved, and all those different stakeholders need to think about like, how to do this.
Because I think it's a nice example for a technical problem, which isn't really a technical problem. Because if that were, I mean, we have autonomous vehicles and they can drive around, technically at least. But then whose kids get onto those Waymo cars and get driven to school and whose don't? And who's going to benefit from that? So I think you see all the potential social, economic consequences play out, and inequalities getting exacerbated and so on. I think that's probably a more interesting question than can we get these things to go to school safely? And I fully agree that autonomous cars, while they are not really autonomous all the time, and they on occasion kill people, they probably kill a lot fewer people than we do. Which then there is the whole question of what's the threshold at which we not only should accept autonomous vehicles, but they should become compulsory. And let's get all those drunks and tired people behind the wheel and let the cars drive themselves. Difficult question. I think we're collectively grappling with it. And I will not predict what it's going to look like in 20 years, but probably different from the way it looks now.
Totally true. Like, this is gonna be a long process. Any other questions? JP, yeah.
Oh no, Stephen had his hand up.
Mine is many of us are educators. What should we teach? I'm at a university, other levels of education. What should we teach people about AI?
To think about it. To not just accept it. I mean, it is a question I'm asking myself, because I am teaching all 380 final year students in Nottingham, computer scientists. And so what do we teach them? And I think what is required is really this ability and willingness to question yourself and your own assumptions. It's not so much, I mean, they can learn whatever they want in terms of programming languages and machine learning models and whatever. But I think the education part of that is to be able to understand where this technology sits in its social and socioeconomic context, and how you can think about it. So how you can construct various different ethical arguments, that there is relevance to different ethical theories, that deontology has a place in life, and so on. To me, if the students leave the university environment, and while they may not necessarily love the topic, at least understand it's there and it's something that they as a professional should engage with, I would count that as a success.
Thank you, because your talk is coming at the exact right time, because I am right now trying to develop a course for incoming freshmen on fair and responsible AI use.
Yeah.
Which I've come up with 10 different ways of interpreting my own title there. So you've really helped me focus things. It's terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefan and Bernd. As a teacher, I also encourage my students to at least to try it out. Like right now, we have so powerful Gen AI tools out there. And if you don't use it, and it also kind of raises equity issues here. Some students gonna use it anyway in their daily life, and if you don't try it out, you will never know what kind of things you're missing there.
Well, if you teach a course on professional ethics to final year students, certainly in Nottingham, and you ask them things like what would be key arguments from a deontological perspective on case study X, you will see that at least half of them immediately get out their ChatGPT and say, well, and ChatGPT, of course, gives good answers. It produces good arguments. And so I'm not trying to discourage them from that. I'm just trying to get them to engage with it and agree or disagree with it. Right? And I think in that sense, it's really valuable, also as an example of the topic itself while you're teaching the topic.
True. Any other questions? If not, I would love to thank, Dr. Bernd Stahl for such a wonderful talk. I have learned a lot myself, especially from the framework perspectives. It's very helpful, kind of provide us a big picture about how we should approach AI and AI ethics, and it's fascinating. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and I hope you have a good day. My day is over.
Oh yeah, it's already very, very late. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye. Yeah.
Thank you, Bernd.
Yeah, I also love to thank all the attendees here to join us. Thank you so much.
Thank you for organizing, Chenwei.
Thank you, Minu. Great to see you again, JP. I loved your question.
Oh yeah. Thanks for keeping me on the list. It's been a while, but yeah, I'm on sabbatical. That's why I look so relaxed. So.
Awesome. Enjoy your sabbatical, and thank you so much for joining us even during your sabbatical.
Oh yeah. Well, thanks for keeping the good stuff coming. So, all right.
Awesome. Yeah, bye. Take care.
Bye. See ya. See you, Minu. Bye.
Bye, JP.